The smoke was still rising from my cornfield when my phone buzzed. It was my neighbor Dale, 2 properties over, and all he said was, "Marcus, you need to see this." I walked to the fence line and looked east toward the development, and I watched the fire that had just eaten 6 months of my work turn in the wind and begin moving toward the most expensive homes in the county. The HOA board president was still standing on the gravel road with her arms crossed when the first ember landed on her roof. She did not notice it immediately. She was too busy watching my field burn to look up. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake had been 3 weeks earlier, when she decided that burning my livelihood was an appropriate way to enforce a fence ordinance. Stick around, because what happened next involved 4 fire departments, a federal agricultural investigator, and a settlement that people in this county are still talking about. My name is Marcus Webb, and I have farmed the same 280 acres in the river bottom outside of Crestfield for 16 years. Before that, I farmed alongside my uncle Leonard, who taught me everything I know about corn and soybeans and dryland wheat, and the particular patience that the land requires from the people who work it. Leonard passed 8 years ago and left me the northern section of his property, which joined with what I already owned to make the operation what it is today. Farming is not something I fell into. It is something I chose deliberately after a decade working in agricultural finance that showed me every side of the industry except the one I actually wanted, which was my hands in the dirt and my decisions on the line and the sky overhead telling me every morning what kind of day I was going to have. The development called Crestfield Preserve went in 5 years ago on land that had previously been a combination of defunct orchard property and scrub pasture on the eastern edge of my county. The developer was a company from out of state that had a formula for this kind of project: large lots, high-end finishes, a name that suggested preserved nature while systematically removing it. They built 38 homes in 18 months. The homes were beautiful in the way that things built for people who will not maintain them are beautiful, which is to say, initially and from a distance. The HOA they established to govern the development was named, with the kind of irony that nobody involved seemed to notice, the Crestfield Preserve Community Standards Association. The president of the Community Standards Association was a woman named Renata Voss. Renata had moved into the development in its second year, buying one of the larger properties on the eastern edge, which put her directly adjacent to the fence line separating Crestfield Preserve from my northern cornfield. She was a woman in her mid-50s who had spent her career in corporate event management, which had given her a planner's sensibility, an eye for detail, and an absolute conviction that environments could and should be controlled to produce desired outcomes. She had applied this conviction to her HOA presidency with an energy that the development's other residents initially found reassuring and eventually found exhausting. Renata and I had been in minor conflict for most of the 3 years since she became president. The conflicts were the predictable ones that arise whenever a residential development is placed adjacent to a working farm. She had complained about dust during my spring tillage operations. She had complained about the smell during fertilizer application. She had complained, in a letter that I found genuinely remarkable for its specificity, about the sound of my irrigation pumps running at night, which she described as an industrial intrusion on the residential acoustic environment. I had responded to each complaint with the patience that 16 years of farming and a thorough understanding of the Right to Farm statute had given me, and each complaint had gone nowhere because the law was clear and my operation was protected. The fence was different. The fence in question ran along the northern boundary of my property, separating my cornfield from the gravel access road that served as the eastern edge of the Crestfield Preserve development. It was a standard agricultural fence, 5 strands of barbed wire on treated wood posts, the kind of fence that has separated farm from road across this region for 100 years. It was functional, well-maintained, and entirely appropriate for an agricultural boundary. It was not decorative. It was not painted. It did not coordinate with the visual aesthetic of the development across the road. Renata had been looking at my fence from her back windows for 3 years, and the looking had not improved her opinion of it. In the spring of last year, she pushed through an HOA provision that established a visual buffer standard for properties adjacent to the development, requiring that fences and structures visible from Crestfield Preserve properties meet certain aesthetic guidelines. The provision named specific acceptable fencing styles and materials. Barbed wire agricultural fencing was not among them. The provision required any non-compliant fencing within site of development properties to be replaced or screened within 180 days. My fence was on my property. The HOA provision applied, by its plain language, to properties adjacent to the development, which it defined as including my parcel. Whether a private HOA could impose aesthetic requirements on a neighboring property that was not part of the development was a question my attorney, a man named Steve Hargrove, who had handled agricultural matters in our county for 25 years, found legally interesting for about 45 minutes before concluding that the answer was no. The HOA's authority extended to its member properties. I was not a member. My fence was not subject to their guidelines regardless of what those guidelines said. Steve wrote a concise letter to Renata explaining this. She wrote back saying that the provision had been adopted by the board and was in effect, and that non-compliance would result in action. Steve wrote back again, more specifically this time, citing the relevant statutes and the HOA's jurisdictional limits. Renata did not write back. The 180 days passed. Nothing happened for another 3 weeks. And then on a Tuesday morning in August, when I was on the east side of my property running maintenance checks on the pivot irrigation system, my farmhand Jesse came over the radio and said, "Marcus, there are people at the north fence." I got there in 7 minutes. What I found was a crew of 3 men in unmarked work clothes, a woman I recognized as Renata Voss standing on the gravel road with a clipboard, and a small pile of my fence posts already pulled from the ground and stacked on the road shoulder. I stopped my truck and got out and walked to the fence line, and I looked at Renata, and I looked at the crew, and I looked at the posts on the ground. I asked her what she was doing. She said she was remedying a non-compliant visual obstruction under the Crestfield Preserve community standards. I told her she was on my fence, on my property boundary, and that she had no authority over either. She told me the HOA had authorized the action. I told her the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property and that she needed to stop the crew immediately. She told the crew to continue. I called Steve Hargrove on the spot. Steve told me to document everything, call the county sheriff, and not touch anyone or anything. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and reported an ongoing trespass and destruction of property at my location. Then I stood there and documented the crew pulling posts while Renata stood on the road with her clipboard and the expression of someone who was completing a task she had been looking forward to for some time. The deputy arrived in 22 minutes. By that point, the crew had removed 11 posts and approximately 60 feet of fence wire. The deputy assessed the situation, spoke with Renata, reviewed the documentation Steve had provided me for exactly this scenario, which I had printed and kept in my truck for 3 weeks, and informed Renata that she was directing the destruction of private property on a boundary she did not have authority over and that the crew needed to stop. Renata told the deputy that the HOA's legal counsel had reviewed the action. The deputy said that was between her and her counsel, and that the immediate issue was that the crew was destroying property they had no right to destroy and that it needed to stop now. The crew stopped. Renata gathered her clipboard and got into her vehicle, a white SUV that she reversed up the gravel road with more speed than was entirely safe, and left. The deputy took my statement and the documentation and advised me to contact my attorney and pursue the matter through civil channels. Steve filed for an injunction and damages the following morning. The injunction was granted within 48 hours because the legal situation was straightforward. The damages claim addressed the cost of the fence repair, the labor, the posts, the wire, and the time. I thought that was the end of the immediate conflict. Renata would see the injunction, understand that she had overstepped, and the legal process would address the damages. This was the optimistic assessment of a man who had not fully understood who he was dealing with. Renata's response to the injunction was to call an emergency HOA meeting and pass a resolution declaring my fence a public nuisance under a provision she enacted at the same meeting. She had her board vote on the new provision and then immediately vote to act under it, both in the same session, both without the notice period required by the HOA's own charter. Steve reviewed the resolution and said it was so procedurally defective that it would not survive a challenge, but that the HOA appeared to be escalating rather than retreating, which sometimes happened when a governing body had convinced itself that doubling down was a form of strength. I was about to find out exactly how far Renata was willing to go. 3 weeks after the injunction, on a dry Wednesday evening in late August, I was in my farmhouse when Jesse called me on the radio. His voice had a tightness in it that I had learned over 4 years to pay attention to. He said, "Marcus, the North Field is on fire." I was out the door in under a minute. The North Cornfield was the largest continuous section of my operation, 83 acres of corn in the final 6 weeks before harvest, standing 8 feet tall and bone dry in the August heat. A fire in that field at that time of year was not a containable event. It was a catastrophe. The fire had started at the fence line. I could see that immediately from the burn pattern, the way the char ran along the base of the remaining fence posts and spread inward from the roadside. Multiple start points. I counted at least 3 in the first 200 feet of fence line before the smoke made it impossible to see clearly. I called 911. I called Jesse to start the water tank on the tractor and worked the southern edge to protect the outbuildings. And then I did the thing that I had been doing since Renata had first appeared at my fence line with her clipboard. I pulled out my phone and I documented. I documented the burn pattern at the fence line. I documented the 3 ignition points I could identify. I documented the direction of the fire's spread, which was northwest, driven by the dry August wind that had been running all day at about 15 miles per hour from the southeast. And then I turned and I looked southeast, in the direction the wind was coming from, toward Crestfield Preserve, and I thought about what 15 miles per hour in that direction meant for a fire that was going to be burning for some time. The development was not immediately adjacent to my north field. There was the gravel road, and then a grass buffer of about 30 yards, and then the development's eastern fence line, and then the first row of properties. 30 yards of dry August grass in a 15-mile-per-hour wind, with a field fire generating its own thermal column and throwing embers, is not a meaningful barrier. It is approximately 8 seconds of travel time for an ember. I watched the fire move through my corn. I watched the fire departments arrive, 2 engines from the county and 1 from the neighboring township, and I watched them establish a line and work it. And I watched, because the wind was what it was, and the thermal column was what it was, and physics is not something you negotiate with, the first ember land in the grass buffer between the road and the development. Then another, then several at once. Grass buffer caught in under 3 minutes. The fire department saw it and split resources, which was the right call and which they executed well, but a grass fire in August moves faster than corn, and the buffer was consumed before the second engine could establish a line on it. The first ember reached the development at approximately the same time that Renata Voss, who had been standing on the gravel road watching my cornfield burn, turned around and saw that the grass behind her was on fire. She ran, I will give her that. She moved quickly and she got clear of the road, and she was not injured, which was the outcome that mattered regardless of everything else. But in moving quickly, she did not get far enough, and she was still close enough to watch the first ember land on the cedar shake roof of the development's entry structure, a decorative gatehouse that she had championed and which had cost the HOA $30,000 from their reserve fund. The gatehouse was fully involved in under 4 minutes. The cedar shake was not a material chosen for its fire resistance. 3 homes on the eastern edge of Crestfield Preserve sustained fire damage that night. None of them were total losses. The fire departments did their jobs and did them well, and all 3 structures were saved with the damage contained to exterior elements, and in one case a garage. No one was injured. The development's landscaping on the eastern edge, the expensive plantings that Renata had specified in the visual buffer plan she had tried to impose on my fence line, was largely destroyed. Renata's own home was not among those damaged. Her property was set back further from the eastern edge, and the fire did not reach it. I want to be clear about this because it matters to the accuracy of the account. What she lost was not her house. What she lost was something she may have valued more, which was the story she had been telling herself about what kind of person she was and what she had a right to do. I stood at my fence line in the early morning after the fire departments had left, and I looked at 83 acres of standing corn reduced to black nothing. 6 months of work, the irrigation investment, the seed cost, the fertilizer and the labor, and the 16 years of accumulated knowledge about how to grow a crop in that specific piece of ground, all of it expressed in those 83 acres, all of it gone. The fire marshal was on scene by 6 in the morning. His name was Investigator Hollies, and he was thorough and experienced, and he walked the fence line with me in the early light, and he looked at the ignition patterns without saying much for a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Webb, I need you to tell me everything about the situation with your fence and the development next door." I told him to come inside, and I would make coffee, and it would take a while. It took 2 hours. I gave him the complete file, every letter, every HOA notice, the injunction, the documentation from the day the crew pulled my fence posts, the deputy's report. Investigator Hollies read through it at my kitchen table with a methodical care that told me he had been doing this work for a long time and knew how to recognize a situation that had a history behind it. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Mr. Webb, I am going to need to speak with several people today." Then he picked up his radio, and he made a call that I later learned was to the regional office of the USDA's Agricultural Law Enforcement Division, which has jurisdiction in cases involving deliberate destruction of protected agricultural operations. Federal jurisdiction. Renata had not thought about federal jurisdiction when she stood on the gravel road watching my corn burn. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the county had seen in recent memory. Federal agricultural investigators, county sheriff detectives, and the state fire marshal's office all worked the case simultaneously, and they worked it with the kind of thoroughness that comes from multiple agencies, each wanting to establish their piece of the record. Phone records were subpoenaed. The work crew who had pulled my fence posts were interviewed, and their records were examined for any connection to the fire. Security camera footage from the development's own entrance cameras, the cameras on the expensive gatehouse that was now a pile of charred cedar, was recovered and reviewed. The footage was the piece that closed the circle. The development's entrance cameras faced both inward toward the development and outward toward the gravel road. The outward-facing camera, in the hour before the fire, had recorded a vehicle stopping on the gravel road near the fence line. The vehicle was on the road for approximately 11 minutes. The image quality was sufficient for the investigators to identify the vehicle. It was Renata's white SUV. I was not present when Renata was informed of this. I was told about it by Steve, who had been notified by the federal investigator who had been in contact with him throughout the process. Steve called me on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Marcus, she is cooperating." I asked what cooperating meant. He said it meant that the alternative was worse and that she had understood that. I asked what she had said. He said that was between her and the investigators and would become part of the record in due course. What became part of the record in due course was a full account of what had happened on the gravel road that evening. Renata had not acted alone. She had recruited 2 people, one of them a board member named Craig Dunmore, and one of them a contractor she had used for various development maintenance projects, and the 3 of them had started the fire at the fence line using materials they had prepared in advance. The intent, as she described it to investigators, had been to destroy the fence line vegetation so that the fence posts could be more easily removed and the visual obstruction eliminated. She had not intended to burn the crop. She had believed the fire would be contained to the fence line. This is what people who have never worked with fire believe. They believe it is a tool they can control. Farmers know better. Anyone who has ever watched a field fire move in an August wind knows better. Renata had looked at my fence line and seen a problem she wanted to solve and had not thought about what 83 acres of standing corn at the edge of a dry late summer field plus 15 miles per hour of warm wind would produce when she introduced an ignition source. She found out The fire departments worked through the night. I stayed on the property, which is what you do when it is your land and your crop, and there is nothing useful you can do except be present. Jesse stayed with me. We stood at the southern end of the North Field and watched the crews work the eastern line, and at some point after midnight, the fire was declared contained, which did not mean it was out. It meant it was no longer spreading, and in a destroyed cornfield, the difference between out and contained is mostly academic, because the destruction is already complete either way. I walked the field boundary in the early morning hours in the beam of a flashlight, and I looked at what remained of 83 acres of corn, and I made myself account for it the way you account for things that are real and true and have to be faced. The monetary loss was calculable. The corn was 6 weeks from harvest, at or near its peak market value, and the insurance adjuster who came out the following morning put the crop loss figure at just under $300,000 at current commodity prices, not including the loss of the equipment time and the input costs that went into producing a crop that would not be harvested. The fence damage was additional but minor relative to the crop figure. The real loss, the one that does not appear on an insurance form, was the season itself. A farming season is a year of decisions, each one made at the right moment or not at all. The spring tillage and the planting timing and the fertility adjustments and the irrigation management and the pest scouting and the 100 small judgments that accumulate into a healthy crop standing in a field in late August. That season was gone. You could not replant it. You could plant again in the spring, but that would be a different season, a different set of decisions, and the work of this one was simply erased. I sat with that in the early morning hours in a way that I think you can only really sit with something if you have spent years doing work that can be destroyed in a single night. Farmers understand loss in a particular way because loss is built into the occupation. Hail can take a crop. Drought can take a crop. Flood, frost, disease, any of these things can take a crop, and they have taken mine in various forms over 16 years, and I have absorbed each one and gone back to work the following season. What I was absorbing that night was different not because of the scale, but because of the cause. Weather does not have intent. This did. Jesse brought 2 cups of coffee from the farmhouse at around 3 in the morning, and we sat on the tailgate of my truck at the field boundary and drank them without saying much. Jesse had worked for me for 4 years, and he knew the North Field as well as I did. He had been in it every week of that growing season. He looked at the black ground and the gray ash and the occasional ember still glowing in the dark, and he said, "Marcus, what are you going to do?" I told him I was going to do exactly what the law permitted me to do, completely, thoroughly, and without stopping until it was done. He nodded and finished his coffee and said, "All right then." The investigation accelerated in ways I had not anticipated once the federal involvement began. Investigator Hollies from the State Fire Marshal's Office and the USDA federal agent, a woman named Special Agent Carla Dyers, who drove down from the regional office and arrived on day 2 of the investigation, worked together with a complementary efficiency that suggested they had collaborated on cases before. Agent Dyers was particularly interested in the documentation I had accumulated over 3 years, the complete file of HOA correspondence, the injunction materials, the deputy's report from the day the fence crew had been stopped. She read through it at my kitchen table on the second afternoon, and when she finished, she looked up and said, "Mr. Webb, you kept excellent records." I told her I had learned early in this situation that documentation was the only thing that would matter when the time came. She said the time had come, and the documentation was going to matter considerably. What Agent Dyers explained to me about the federal agricultural protection statutes was something Steve had outlined for me in general terms, but that she filled in with specific detail. The federal right to farm protections that existed in our state were part of a broader federal framework that had been strengthened in the previous decade, specifically because of an increase in cases where residential developments placed adjacent to agricultural operations had taken deliberate actions to interfere with those operations. The framework included criminal provisions with federal sentencing guidelines and civil provisions with treble damages, and it was designed to be used. Agent Dyers said she had worked a dozen of these cases and that the documentation and the security camera footage together made this one of the cleaner fact patterns she had encountered. I asked her what clean meant in this context. She said it meant that the evidentiary path from the known conflict to the known defendants to the identified vehicle at the scene to the origin of the fire was short and well documented and would be difficult to dispute. She said that in her experience, cases with this kind of evidentiary clarity tended to resolve through cooperation rather than trial, because the defendant's attorneys, once they reviewed the evidence, generally advised their clients that cooperation was the better option. She said she expected that to happen here. She was correct. The security footage was reviewed by both agencies within the first week. The development's entrance cameras had been installed as part of Renata's entry enhancement project, the same project that had produced the $30,000 Cedar Shake gatehouse. The cameras had been placed to capture the entrance road for security purposes, and they had done exactly that on the evening of the fire. The footage showed Renata's vehicle stopping on the gravel road, the fence line. It showed two individuals getting out. It showed activity along the fence line for approximately 11 minutes. It did not show the ignition clearly because the angle was not right for that, but it showed the individuals returning to the vehicle and leaving, and it showed, approximately 4 minutes after the vehicle left, the first visible flame at the fence line. 4 minutes from the time the vehicle drove away to the time the first flame appeared at the fence line. That is how long it takes for an accelerant-started fire to develop to visibility in dry late summer vegetation. Investigator Hollies put that detail in his report and noted that it was consistent with the use of a delayed ignition device, which was an additional element that elevated the criminal charges. Renata retained an attorney within 3 days of being contacted by the investigators. Her attorney, to his credit, appears to have reviewed the evidence and given her a clear assessment of the situation because she moved to cooperation relatively quickly. Craig Dunmore retained his own attorney and also cooperated. Philip Stark, the contractor, cooperated immediately and provided the most detailed account of what had happened, including his own role and the specific materials that had been used and the specific instructions he had received from Renata regarding the timing and the location. What Philip Stark described was a plan that had been discussed over several weeks, beginning shortly after the court injunction had blocked the HOA's fence removal. Renata had concluded, according to Stark, that the legal avenue was closed and that a direct approach was needed. She had described the goal as eliminating the fence line vegetation so that the posts could be removed without the legal complications that the injunction created, her theory being that if there was no vegetation to preserve at the fence line, the injunction's basis would be weakened. She had not consulted an attorney about this theory. She had not asked anyone whether it was legally sound. She had simply decided it was logical and had begun making arrangements. This was the specific catastrophic failure of reasoning that investigator Hollies noted in his formal report and that Steve noted in our civil filing and that Agent Dyers noted in the federal complaint. Not just that Renata had committed arson, but that she had committed it in pursuit of a legal theory that was entirely wrong. The injunction's basis was not the fence line vegetation. It was the property rights and the jurisdictional limits of the HOA. Burning the vegetation would not have affected the injunction in any way. She had destroyed 83 acres of corn and set her own neighborhood's eastern border on fire in pursuit of a goal that the action could not have achieved, even if everything had gone exactly as she planned. Steve said this when he was briefing me on the investigation findings, and he said it with the measured restraint of a man who had been practicing law for a long time and had learned not to editorialize, but I could hear something underneath the restraint that was close to a 25-year attorney's version of disbelief. He said, "Marcus, she did not ask a lawyer." I told him that was becoming clear. He said that if she had asked a lawyer, the lawyer would have told her in about 3 minutes that her theory was wrong. I told him that seemed likely. He said it was a remarkable thing, and then he returned to the specifics of the filing. Insert into Part 2, after settlement section, The fallout for the development extended beyond the financial. Crestfield Preserve had been marketed and had marketed itself through its HOA newsletters and community communications as a premier residential environment distinguished by its high standards and careful governance. The criminal charges against its president and one of its board members, the federal involvement, the civil litigation, and the 11 days of local newspaper coverage that followed the investigation's development had made the development's name synonymous in the county with exactly the opposite of what it had advertised. 3 properties were listed for sale within the first month after the charges were filed, 2 more within the following 6 weeks. The market response was what you would expect when a development's governance infrastructure is publicly revealed to have committed federal crimes. Thomas Park told me, when he stopped by for a conversation in the fall of the year after the fire, that the development had a new quality now that he was still adjusting to. He said the silence was different. Not the silence of a community that was governing itself with a firm hand, the way it had felt under Renata's presidency, but the silence of a community that had been through something and was trying to find its footing again. He said the new board was careful and quiet and did not send many communications, which he found, after 3 years of receiving Renata's newsletters, a relief. He said people waved to each other again when they drove past, which he had not realized had stopped until it started again. I told him I was glad to hear it. I told him that what I wanted, what I had always wanted, was a neighbor, not a governance structure, not an enforcement body, just a neighbor, the ordinary kind, the kind that waves when you drive past and does not send certified letters about your fence line. He said he thought that was what they were going to be now. I told him I was counting on it. The Northfield came in well the second year back. The fallow had done what fallow does, which is reset the ground and let it breathe, and the fertility numbers in the spring samples were the best I had seen on that section in years. Jesse said the stands looked better than the crop that had burned, and I told him he was probably right. You cannot choose what destroys something you have built, but sometimes what gets rebuilt afterward is stronger for the building. I have thought about Renata occasionally in the time since, not with anger, which surprised me, because I had carried enough of that during the years of the conflict that I expected it to last longer. What replaced it was something more like the specific clarity you get when a situation has been completely resolved and the only thing left is the fact of it. She had made a long series of decisions, each one following from the previous one, each one escalating because the one before had not worked, and the series had ended where it ended, which was in a federal plea agreement and a 2-page apology letter in a plain envelope. I do not know what she learned from it. That is not mine to know. What I know is what I learned, which is that the systems built to protect people who do their work honestly on their own land can actually work if you understand them and use them and do not stop. That is not a small thing to know. I carry it with me every morning when I check the Northfield, the same fence line, the ground that has given back more than was taken from it, the way ground does when you give it time. Last time I told you about Renata Voss, the HOA president who destroyed 60 feet of my fence, watched it get blocked by a court injunction, and then decided the next logical step was to set fire to my cornfield to solve a fence aesthetics dispute. I told you how the August wind carried those embers straight into her own development, and how the investigators found her car on the security footage from the gatehouse she had spent $30,000 building. Today I am going to tell you what federal agricultural jurisdiction looks like when it lands on someone who thought they were just dealing with a local HOA matter, and what the full reckoning looked like for a development that had spent 3 years making a farmer's life difficult. The criminal charges came in layers, which is how federal and state charges often work when multiple agencies are involved in the same investigation. The state charges came first, filed by the county district attorney approximately 6 weeks after the fire. Renata, Craig Dunmore, and the contractor, a man named Philip Stark, were each charged with felony arson, criminal mischief, and reckless endangerment. The arson charge addressed the intentional starting of the fire. The criminal mischief addressed the destruction of my fence property 3 weeks prior. The reckless endangerment addressed the fact that a residential development with 38 occupied homes had been placed in danger by their actions. The federal charges followed 2 weeks later. The USDA's Agricultural Enforcement Division charged all three with willful destruction of a protected agricultural operation under the Federal Right to Farm Protection statutes, which carry penalties separate from and in addition to the state charges. This was the charge that Renata had not anticipated and that her attorney, when she retained one, immediately identified as the most serious element of her exposure. Federal agricultural destruction charges are not minor regulatory matters. They are felonies with significant sentencing guidelines, and they carry the weight of federal prosecution, which is a different category of legal pressure than a county courthouse. I will not pretend that I was not gratified by the federal charges. I had spent 3 years responding to complaints about dust and smell and irrigation pumps and fence aesthetics, 3 years of documented harassment through legal mechanisms that were never going to succeed, but that cost me time and money and the particular draining energy of having to defend your right to do your job on your own land. The federal charges were not something I had engineered. They were the natural consequence of Renata's own decisions intersecting with a legal framework that she had not bothered to understand before she decided to start a fire on the boundary of a protected agricultural operation. But I was grateful for them, and I told Steve that. And Steve said that he had been practicing agricultural law for 25 years, and that this was one of the more complete examples of a situation resolving itself that he had seen. The civil case ran in parallel. Steve had filed it immediately after the fire with a damages claim that addressed the crop loss, the fence destruction, the legal costs accumulated over 3 years of HOA harassment, and the additional federal provisions related to agricultural interference. The civil case named Renata individually, Craig Dunmore individually, Philip Stark individually, and the Crestfield Preserve Community Standards Association as an entity on the separate question of the pattern of bad faith enforcement actions against my property. The HOA's situation was complicated by the fact that 2 of its board members, Renata and Craig, were criminal defendants, and by the fact that the civil suit's damages claim was substantially larger than the HOA's reserve fund. When I say substantially larger, I mean that Steve's calculation of the full damages, including the crop loss at market value, the treble damages available under the Federal Agricultural Interference Statute, the 3 years of accumulated harassment costs, and the punitive component, produced a number that the HOA's insurance carrier reviewed, and then quietly indicated they were reserving their right to deny coverage on the grounds that the acts were deliberate and therefore excluded. An HOA without insurance coverage facing a civil damages claim that exceeds its reserves is an HOA that is looking at special assessments against its members, which means 38 households who had nothing to do with burning my cornfield were potentially on the hook for what Renata and Craig had done. This fact, when it became clear to the remaining board members in a meeting I was told about by Steve, produced a response that could charitably be described as a crisis of leadership and less charitably as complete operational collapse. 3 board members resigned in the same week. The HOA's property management company suspended its services pending clarification of the legal situation. The development's common areas, the manicured entry landscaping that Renata had overseen, and the shared amenity spaces that justified the HOA fees went unmaintained. A resident named Thomas Park, who had lived in Crestfield Preserve since the development's first year and who had served briefly on the board before deciding it was not for him, called me in the 3rd week after the fire. He introduced himself and said he was calling on behalf of a group of residents who wanted to understand the situation from my perspective and whether there was a path through it that did not require the development's 38 households to be collectively destroyed financially for the decisions of 2 people. I told him I appreciated the call and that the path through it was the legal process and that the legal process would move at the speed it moved at, but that my interest was in being made whole for what I had lost, not in punishing people who had not been involved in making me lose it. Thomas said that was what he had hoped to hear. He said he would be in touch. What Thomas organized over the following 3 weeks was something I had not expected, and that I found genuinely moving in the way that you find things moving when they demonstrate that people are better than the worst behavior of the people who had been claiming to represent them. He organized a group of 22 of the development's 38 households, a solid majority, who were prepared to collectively pursue two things simultaneously. First, the removal of Renata and Craig from any HOA position, which was accomplished through a special meeting and a community vote that was neither close nor slow. Second, the negotiation of a good-faith settlement in the civil case that would address my damages without requiring a full litigation that nobody could afford and that would take years. The settlement negotiation was handled by Steve on my side and a mediator that Thomas's group retained on theirs, because the HOA as a formal entity was in too much disarray to negotiate coherently. What emerged after 6 weeks of careful work was a structure that addressed the damages from multiple directions. Renata's personal assets, which were exposed through her individual liability in the criminal case, contributed a substantial portion. Craig Dunmore's contribution was smaller but real. Philip Stark, the contractor, cooperated fully with the investigators and negotiated separately. The HOA's insurance carrier, after extended negotiation that Steve described as among the more determined conversations of his professional life, agreed to cover a portion of the claim under a theory of inadequate supervision of board activities, which was a limited but real source of funds. The remaining gap was addressed through a special assessment against the member households that, while not insignificant, was manageable rather than ruinous. The total settlement addressed the crop loss at full market value, the fence repair costs, 3 years of documented harassment expenses, and Steve's fees from the entire duration of the conflict. It did not include the treble damages that were theoretically available under the federal statute, because applying them in full would have made the settlement impossible for the households to absorb, and because Steve advised me that a settlement I could actually collect was more valuable than a judgment I could not. He was right about that. He is usually right about that kind of thing. The criminal cases resolved over the following year. Renata pled guilty to state arson charges and to the federal agricultural destruction charge. Her sentence included a period of community service, substantial fines, and a term of probation. The federal conviction carried employment restrictions that affected her professional life for years. Craig Dunmore received a similar but lesser sentence, reflecting his secondary role. Philip Stark, who had cooperated fully, received probation and fines. Renata was required, as part of her plea, to write a formal apology letter to me that would be entered into the court record. Steve told me this had been a condition he had insisted on and that the prosecution had supported. I received it on a Thursday afternoon in a plain envelope with the court's return address. I opened it at the kitchen table and read it. It was 2 pages. I will not describe its contents in detail because some things are private, but I will say that it was not a form letter, it was not written by an attorney, and that it was the most genuine document I received from Renata in 4 years of correspondence. I kept it. The cornfield was replanted the following spring. The ground had been fallowed over the winter, and I had spent the time with the soil samples, adjusting the fertility program, preparing the seed bed properly rather than rushing. Jesse and I put the crop in on a May morning when the soil temperature was exactly right, and the sky was clear, and the east wind was cool and soft, nothing like the August wind that had carried the fire, just the ordinary working wind of a plains spring morning. We drove the rows in the early light, and the seed went in, and the field closed over it, and I got off the planter at the end of the last pass, and I stood there for a while. You farm because you believe in the return of things. You put something in the ground and you tend it and you wait, and the ground gives it back to you changed, multiplied, alive. This is not a metaphor. It is a fact about corn and soil and time that I have understood since I was young and that I understand better every year. The field that Renata burned was the same ground my Uncle Leonard had planted for 30 years before me. It did not need her permission to grow again. It just needed a season and a farmer willing to put the work in. Thomas Park stopped by that fall when the crop was standing full and tall and the harvest was 2 weeks out. He stood at the field boundary and looked at it for a while and said it looked like good corn. I told him it was better than the field it replaced, which was the truth. The fallow winter had done the ground some good. He laughed at that, and I laughed with him, and we stood there in the September light and looked at what the ground had made of itself, given time and care and the ordinary faith that farmers carry into every planting season, whether they name it that or not. Crestfield Preserve is still there. New people have moved in as others have sold in the aftermath of the assessments and the publicity. The new HOA board sends a quarterly newsletter about maintenance schedules and community events and nothing else. Nobody has complained about my fence in 2 years. It is a standard agricultural barbed wire fence on treated posts. Exactly as it has always been, exactly as it will continue to be. I drive past the development's entrance most mornings on my way to check the north field. The gatehouse that burned was rebuilt, smaller this time, with metal roofing instead of cedar shake. The new board made that decision on purely practical grounds, with no input from anyone regarding aesthetics. I appreciated that. The fence line where the fire started runs straight and clear and clean. The posts are new, the wire is tight, and the ground along it is green again, the way ground gets when it has had time and rain and no one interfering with it. I run my hand along the wire sometimes when I am checking that section. It is a habit I picked up in the year after the fire, and I have not stopped it. The wire is just wire, cold and functional, and exactly what a fence is supposed to be. Some things are worth protecting. Sometimes you have to prove it. She set my field on fire over a fence. The wind had the final word.